Hello, and welcome to today's KraneShares webinar, Insights from the Ground, Understanding Taiwan's Political Climate with Gavekal. Hello, my name is Brendan Ahern. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of KraneShares Exchange Traded Funds. Joining me today is KraneShares Managing Director and former U.S. Ambassador to Singapore, David Adelman, along with Gavekal's Senior Asia Analyst, Tom Miller. KraneShares has been a client of Gavekal's independent macro research for several years. Founded in 1999, the Hong Kong-based firm is focused on the global economy with its Gavekal Dragonomics team focused on China's economy, politics, and social issues. Following a 10-day trip to Taiwan, Tom wrote a fantastic piece titled The View from Taiwan. We are appreciative of both Tom and Gavekal for joining us today to share their insights on Tom's visit. Please proactively ask questions during the webinar as we hope for a lively question and answer post Tom's presentation. If you're viewing us on KraneShares.com, please email us any questions at info@KraneShares.com, or if joining us today on Zoom, questions can be asked in the Q&A button. For those of you that have a CFP or a CIMA designation, CE credits, continuing education credits, can be accumulated today. Please email us at ce@KraneShares.com. Well, let's dive in. But briefly, let's give a quick overview of KraneShares, just in case you're not familiar with our organization. KraneShares founder Jonathan Crane formed two core beliefs during his experience living and building a successful business in China. These two beliefs were the basis for founding KraneShares over 10 years ago. First, while new China sectors such as domestic consumption, internet, e-commerce, 5G, semiconductor, clean energy, and healthcare have become the new drivers of China's economic growth, these sectors are still underallocated in global portfolios. Second, the opening of China's mainland equity markets, the second largest in the world, and China's mainland fixed income market, also the second largest in the world, will have a significant effect on investors' portfolios in the years to come as these markets are included into global indices. Most importantly, we endeavor to earn the trust of investors through our balanced perspective on China's economy and capital markets. China's rise in market indices along with its economy will necessitate investors have a partner to navigate these developments. KraneShares wants to earn that partnership role with you. We maintain a daily research blog that is available at www.chinalastnight.com, which we encourage you to subscribe in order to keep abreast of new developments. KraneShares Exchange Traded Funds is a diverse suite of both thematic as well as China access vehicles. We've also diversified in what we believe will be the second largest trend over the next century in addition to China, which is climate change with our suite of climate ETFs, including our carbon credit allowance ETFs. With that, let's dive in. Tom is an author and analyst at Gavekal Research, a Hong Kong-based research firm that serves institutional investors around the world. Tom writes mainly about emerging market economies, especially China and India, focused on geopolitics, economic development, and international trade and investment. As a former journalist, Tom has reported in more than 20 countries. Tom was educated at Oxford University and SOAS in London and studied Chinese at universities in Beijing. He's an acclaimed author, having written China's Urban Billion, the story behind the biggest migration in human history, as well as China's Asian Dream, empire building along the New Silk Road. Tom has been based in the United Kingdom since 2015 after 14 years living and working in China. Welcome to today's webinar, Tom. Very much appreciative for the great piece you wrote. And David and I are looking forward to a healthy dialogue after your presentation. So I'll hand things off to you right now.
Great. Thanks very much, Brendan. I'm just checking that I am on camera because I can't see myself.
You are indeed.
I am. Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and let me thank you on behalf of Gavekal May I ask, actually, if you could possibly put my face up, because then I can feel that I really am talking as opposed to just speaking. Yes, that's much more comfortable for me. Thank you. When I first agreed to do this, you asked me, Brendan, if I would like to show a few photos, just to kind of give a little bit of flavor of what Taiwan's like. Now, I don't want to bore people with a sort of 1970s style photo slide. But what I have done, though, is to put a few photos and a couple of charts into what looks like a presentation, but I don't want it to feel like that. So, the whole point of what we're doing today is a Q&A, but I thought I would give just a sort of brief sort of 5-minute introduction with some photos just to kind of give you the lay of the land, if you like. Now, the point of my talk today is really to try to convey what people in Taiwan think, because I think we hear an awful lot about what people in the US think. We hear a lot from people, particularly in the US Congress, and people in the US military, or all the sort of military-industrial complex, if you want to call it that. And we hear a lot of analysis coming out of think tanks about what China is thinking and may or may not do. But I don't think we hear enough about what people in Taiwan think is going to happen and how they see things. And Taiwan is on the front line, and so I think we should pay more attention to that. So that was the point of my trip to Taiwan earlier in the year. And I think the first thing to say is that people in Taiwan have been living with the threat of war for more than 70 years, and so for many people there, they sort of lowered their guard, if you like. This sort of threat has become sort of background noise. It's not something that preoccupies them, okay, because it's just always been there. But since 2021, we've seen a big rise in military aggression from China, particularly since the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the US Speaker, in 2022. And then, of course, we also have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if you could please put the first slide up. I think, Ukraine has certainly concentrated minds in Taiwan. For the first time, people are really thinking war is possible. And so we're seeing much greater impetus towards military preparation. So defense spending has gone up by 14% this year, and now accounts for about 15% of all government spending. And we've seen compulsory military service increased from 4 months to 1 year as well. And there's a sense in which Taiwan is getting much more serious about arming itself. Now, you could flick on, please, to the next slide. I think what we can definitely say, and this is really a key point, is that although the threat level has certainly risen, people in Taiwan do not think, on the whole, that war is inevitable, and certainly nor do they think that it's imminent. Now, of course, there are different views, different perspectives out there, but on my trip, I spoke to 40 or 50 people, I would say. I was focusing in the first place on defense experts, and then on people from both of the main parties, and then independent thinkers. But also I spoke to people in business, I spoke to investors, and I spoke to a bunch of very ordinary people too. So, people in cafes, in bars, restaurants, taxi drivers, you name it. And I did not find anyone who thought that Taiwan was about to be invaded. And the reason I think this is particularly important to kind of stress is that we've seen a bunch of US military types, admirals, generals. There are sort of 3 or 4 of them who have quite recently been sort of talking about a timetable for an invasion of Taiwan, and making out that it's imminent. And I mean, go into that later. But my overall message is that people in Taiwan are vigilant, but they are calm. There is no panic in Taiwan. Now, if you could flick on, please, to the next slide. Just a very, very brief sort of potted history of Taiwan. I don't want to go into too much depth, but one thing you always hear from the Chinese side is that Taiwan has always been, is, and will always be Chinese. And actually only last week, the foreign minister, Qin Gang, said that Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China's territory since ancient time. Now, this is not true. People from mainland China, as far as we know, began to visit Taiwan in the late 13th century, and people only began to settle there from the late 16th century. And Taiwan was only formally annexed by the Qing government, the Qing dynasty, in 1683. So it's only been under official Chinese control since then. And then you saw a wave of Chinese migration into Taiwan, and for 200 years, it was under Chinese control. But in 1895, after the First Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan was ceded to the Japanese, and for 50 years, it was a Japanese colony and underwent quite a heavy form of Japonification. And even to this day, Taiwan still has quite a sort of distinct sort of sense of Japaneseness, if you like. You can still feel it in Japan. So if you could flick on to the next slide. Yes, this is a street in Tainan, which is a city in southwest Taiwan. It's the oldest city there. The slide before was a picture of a typical Chinese style temple, but this street is very much a Japanese style street, and you can see a lot of Japanese culture around Taiwan. Now, in 1945, with the end of the Second World War, the government on mainland China, which was under the nationalists, it was then the Republic of China, they took over control of Taiwan. But with the end of the Civil War in 1949, the end of the Civil War on the mainland, the government of the Republic of China fled to Taiwan and has stayed there ever since. And for the next 40 years or so, the nationalist government ruled as a sort of single state party in Taiwan until the political transition of the 1980s and 1990s. If you can flick on, please, to the next slide. With democracy, and particularly really since the election in 2000 of the first non-nationalist government, the election of the Democratic Progressive Party, you've seen the growth of a distinct Taiwanese national identity in Taiwan, to the extent now that most people in Taiwan no longer feel Chinese. So roughly a third of people feel Chinese, and 2/3 of people feel distinctly and only uniquely Taiwanese, and then you have about a third who feel both Taiwanese and Chinese. And so Taiwan feels like a very, very distinct place. If you could flick on, please. One of the things that's very noticeable in Taiwan, especially if, like me, you spent a lot of time in China, is that there's very, very robust freedom of speech, and that includes being able to criticize China and the Chinese government and the Communist Party in a very, very direct way. So this is one example. There are many. You see them all over the place, and often they're rather crude, and I decided not to put one of those in here. But this is a poster I saw, I think, on a park in Kaohsiung, which is a big city in southwest Taiwan. And what the Chinese literally says at the top is, it says 共产党, which means Chinese Communist Party, 是撒旦的化身, which means the embodiment of Satan, or to put it into colloquial English, the commies are the devil incarnate. So that's the kind of sort of criticism you get in Taiwan, which you'd obviously never, ever hear in China. If you could flick on, please. And of course, Taiwan fiercely guards its democratic rights. And what happened in Hong Kong 3 years ago with the national security law and the neutering of Hong Kong is felt very, very sharply in Taiwan. One of the big reasons for this is that the PRC, Chinese Communist Party, have always tried to, their aim is to absorb Taiwan into the PRC along the same system that they used to have and officially still have in Hong Kong, which is of one country, two systems. But of course, with the change in Hong Kong status, that no longer looks like a very kind of promising goal for Taiwan. And this is a poster that I saw at the National Political University, where there was a whole sort of democracy freedom wall with an awful lot of sort of anti-CCP propaganda, if you like. But one thing I really ought to emphasize, and if you could please flick on, is that despite this very strong sense of Taiwaneseness, and despite the fact that Taiwan has absolute de facto independence, most Taiwanese do not support formal independence. And this is something I think which is often lost in the debate that you hear in the West. So something like 30% of Taiwanese would like independence at some point, but about 90% would want to maintain the status quo for the moment. People do not want to provoke China, because if Taiwan was ever to proclaim formal independence, they know that they would probably be invaded tomorrow. So that's my brief introduction, and then we can get into the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's certainly, Tom, it's, there's it's a complicated issue, right? And I think, one of the things that, really jumped out to me in your piece was that how calm that, you note that Western media has, it's like this almost frenzy-like environment. And what's kind of surprises me is, that Chinese equities can be, the offshore market can be, be volatile based on, some of this political rhetoric. And yet the Taiwanese market has done, performed pretty well. Japan's market is not affected. U.S. multinationals, which are many that are heavily geared revenue are not affected. It really is this offshore China market. And I don't have a good explanation why this one segment of stocks are so affected by geopolitical, and the securities that are just as liable to be affected in a worst case scenario are not. I think it's kind of an interesting situation, but yeah, I think ultimately, you found that the people in Taiwan were fairly calm, and there was no panic, and I just think it's a very different than what we kind of see and consume from a Western media perspective. And did people in Taiwan have any explanation for why the Western media was, such a hyperbole and exaggeration to some of these headlines?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons out there, but certainly one of the views is that in the US there are good reasons for people in the military-industrial complex, if you like, to kind of play this up. So they see themselves as you have this sort of strategic rivalry between the US and China, and sort of Taiwan is a sort of hot button issue which they can press there. There's also the sense in which Taiwan is a useful market for weaponry as well. And sort of Taiwan is a sort of useful place for kind of pushing this sort of anti-Chinese ideology if you're a hawk. So I think there are a number of reasons, but I think a lot of it sort of comes down to this whole kind of strategic problem between the US and China. Mm-hmm. Taiwan is from the US perspective. It sees itself as sort of the prime Pacific power. Taiwan is part of the first island chain, which is at the kind of perimeter of that. And so there's an important sort of military aspect to it here. Also economically, of course, Taiwan dominates, the high end for chips and sits at the heart of global supply chains, all of which the US, wants to protect. And Taiwan is a key democratic ally in the region, and a sort of alternative vision of a sort of liberal democratic China. And for all of those reasons, it's of strategic importance to the US. And if the US is trying to kind of push this this kind of strategic rivalry, Taiwan is an obvious place to do it.
Yeah, I think it's you note in your in this great research piece that Taiwan. Its economy is heavily geared to China, and David, that kind of you spent as the former ambassador to Singapore. I find that to Tom, your point, that I think you can be pro a strong U.S. defense complex that we as Americans we've benefited from the great service of our military, and yet I think you can also be pro doing business with China. That I don't see them as necessarily contrarian views to want to have, that the U.S. should have a strong military, but also be able to trade, and do business with the second largest economy in the world. And U.S. companies have really benefited from that, and U.S. investors and pension funds. But, David, I was just thinking, Singapore is kind of a different scenario than Taiwan in many respects, but there are kind of quasi, similarities there where, how do you think, from your time in Singapore, you could kind of maybe, compare and contrast how Singapore has kind of navigated this balancing act very similarly to that Taiwan plays?
Well, Brendan, you've used exactly the right word, navigate. But first, let me comment on the first part of your comments. This idea of recognizing the strategic competition, but continuing to do business across the Pacific, whether that be from Europe or the U.S. The big news today, I think, are the remarks made by Great Britain's Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, where despite pressure from within his own party, the Conservative Party, but also from the Tories to be very hawkish on China, he made, I think, a very important speech earlier today in the UK, where he said, China, the rise of China is the most important issue this century, and managing the rise of China is the most important issue facing the world this century. And Great Britain's policies would be threefold. First, to ensure that Great Britain's national security related industries are not dependent upon China. Makes perfect sense, consistent with longstanding policies in Washington and London and elsewhere. Second, to work to get even closer to allies in the region to shore up Great Britain's friendships in the Indo-Pacific. Again, very consistent with traditional foreign policy in Washington and in London and elsewhere. And then third, to do business with China. And the Foreign Secretary recognized that French President Macron recently at a summit in Beijing recognized that high-level EU politicians have recently met in Beijing and signaled that, in fact, similar high-level meetings would be forthcoming between UK leaders and Chinese leaders. This is a very important statement because it speaks to, I think, what the old hands, what the sort of traditional foreign policy makers in London and ultimately in Washington are really talking about, that aren't really making the headlines and aren't getting all of the press attention on Capitol Hill in Washington or in Parliament in London. With regard to Singapore, you make a really great point, and that is that Southeast Asia is obviously watching very closely tensions across the strait. And what you should know is what leaders in Southeast Asia, whether that be Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, what they're saying to policymakers in Europe and in Washington on the margins of the meetings. The Cleverly speech was actually very much newsworthy, but for some time, for years now, as tensions have been reported in the media, what's being whispered from Southeast Asia is, we want calm waters across the Pacific. We don't want to be forced into a big choice between Beijing and Washington, and we depend on trans-Pacific trade and trans-Pacific capital flows to develop our countries. And those whispers on the margins of those meetings and private conversations are very compelling ultimately to policymakers. They don't find their way into speeches made in Washington or comments made on editorial pages, but they are very much central to foreign policy decision-making. So Singapore traditionally has been a lead advisor to both Beijing and Washington. At some risk, I'll say, for the better part of 30 or 40 years, they were almost unique. Lee Kuan Yew was perhaps America's most trusted advisor on all matters related to Asia and especially to China. I was very fortunate to serve as the U.S. ambassador at a time when Lee Kuan Yew was still in the government and still very active. I think I was the last U.S. ambassador to meet with him while he was in the government. And because of the position I had, I suppose I was the American who spent the most time with Lee Kuan Yew. And I can tell you, most of our conversations were about China. And often our conversations were about Taiwan and the South China Sea, and how the South China Sea relates to security in the region, including security across the Taiwan Strait. And Lee Kuan Yew was always very consistent in his message to me. He did not fear China. He believed that China's weakness was it didn't really have strong allies around the world. It's the mirror image of America's strength. America's strength is its alliances around the world. And I think you'll find that Chinese policymakers, especially as it relates to how they manage tensions across the Taiwan Strait, will be with an eye towards not alienating countries, but in fact, finding ways for China to somehow build friendships within Asia and Southeast Asia, but also around the world. And it's here that I think the Ukraine story is very instructive. It is true what you're reading, which is that China is watching the Russia-Ukraine war very closely. What I think that they're taking from that is that the alliances against Russia came together easily and very quickly. That is a cautionary tale for any country that would seek to any extraterritorial activity. It's also true that Russia is a country in decline, and China obviously is a country on the rise. And these two leaders, Putin and Xi, will behave very differently. Where China is seeking to win friends and influence people, Russia was in a very different position with a very one-dimensional economy and very few friends around the world, seeking to stir sort of nationalism to try to revive Russian culture and economics. I'll stop there because I know Tom will have some comments as it relates to the Ukraine-Russia story and how that might affect relations across the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, I think, Tom, one of the great things you noted in your piece was just how, I think, David, to your point, where we felt that, China is economically so geared to the West, where, Putin, Russia has almost nothing to lose. China has everything to lose. And, one of the points you made in the great piece, Tom, was you mentioned that 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China. More than 200 billion has been invested from Taiwanese firms in China, and there is this very, very strong trade relationship. I mean, Foxconn, operates in China making iPhones.
We all have one.
Yeah, but I think that's Taiwan's very different. China's very different than this. People just made this comparison: Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, China. There's just, it's so different. And I don't know, Tom, did in your travels, did that how did that conversation kind of play out?
I mean, to be quite frank with you, people didn't want to speak about Ukraine that much because, it is a very, very different scenario. Sort of superficially, it looks similar because Putin, claims Ukraine as part of the kind of broader Russian world and believes that Ukrainians are essentially Russian, and China, claims Taiwan and believes that Taiwan is essentially Chinese. And so there's this idea that if Russia invades Ukraine, then China's in a position to invade Taiwan. But sort of it's much easier to roll tanks across a flat land border than it is to make a sort of amphibious assault on an island. So they are quite different things. Also, of course, if you look at Taiwan, it's been building up its alliances, and although the US is it's legally obliged to help Taiwan if it's invaded by China, it is not obliged legally under the Taiwan Relations Act to come in and actually fight. Biden has said 4 times that if that happens, the US will come in. And certainly the impression I got from people in Taiwan is that they are convinced that the US would come in on their side. Now, of course, it may depend who's in power. If we have President Trump again, he may have a different view. But that's certainly the way they see it at the moment. And then you also have other allies as well. There's now a strong belief in Taipei that Japan sees Taiwan as a threat to its own national security, and they would come in as well. You've got more and more support from other members of NATO and the G7. Australia, I think they would certainly be a part of that alliance. You have Korea as well, sort of kind of edging in that direction. And to bring in one of the other countries in the region, to add to what David was saying, it's certainly true that those Southeast Asian countries are always worried about being the kind of meat in a sort of US-China sandwich, if you like. They're always trying to kind of tiptoe between them, if you like, because China is the biggest trade partner, and also that it's their neighbor, and they can't move. But at the same time, the US is the big security protector in the region too. So it's about kind of hedging your bets. And the Philippines, you will see recently, has just provided the US with 4 new bases which they can use. And so, the Philippines is another long-standing ally of the US, which had been sort of edging closer towards China, but now seems to be coming back. So there is this whole kind of alliance structure in place. Now, of course, the Ukraine has also had a lot of support from the West, more in terms of sort of sanctions and in terms of sort of help with weaponry, but it doesn't have this sort of alliance structure around it in the same way that Taiwan does. And so it is quite a different scenario. And as I was saying at the outset, this is strategically, Taiwan is so much more important than Ukraine, right? I think the key point to make here is that Taiwan is probably the only place I can think of in the world where the US and China could potentially come to war, because it's where their core interests meet. So for China, Taiwan is what they call the core of their core interests. This really is the ultimate red line. As I say, if Taiwan proclaims independence tomorrow, China will go in, however prepared they are. And
Tom, that's the key point. The key point is, and I think oftentimes this gets forgotten, that Taiwan controls its own destiny, in the sense that if Taiwan does not declare de jure independence as a matter of law, then we can expect the status quo to hold.
Right. Yes. So actually,
it would only be a Taiwanese decision, a decision in Taipei, to disturb the status quo that could create some instability. And of course, really since '49, the position of the ROC, the position of Taipei, has been, why would we declare independence? There's no need to. We are independent. I would add to what you're saying, and I think, Brendan, it's important that we say that all of this supports what I think is kind of an obvious conclusion in Beijing, which is that the cost of a military invasion of Taiwan far exceeds any benefit. It doesn't, in the near or even medium term, based on everything we know, on a cost-benefit basis, result in any justification of a military invasion. In fact, the status quo, I would suggest to you, works very well for China. As you've pointed out, both of you have pointed out so well, the capital flows and trade flows across the strait are quite important, and disrupting those trade and capital flows would be detrimental to China. But more importantly, at least from the geopolitical perspective, disrupting China's interests in developing its own friendships and maybe ultimately its own network of alliances would be, destroyed by that type of.
Could I just come in and make another point here? I agree with all of that. I think an invasion of Taiwan, and actually it probably wouldn't be an invasion. They'd probably do something a little less conventional, maybe sort of economic blockade first, would be potentially, almost certainly, kind of suicidal for China. Economic suicide, political suicide. Even if they were to succeed, there would be massive losses, and that could potentially put Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party into trouble. But having said that, though, there is the great unknown here, and this is what was stressed to me again and again in Taiwan, is that we never know what Xi Jinping himself is going to do, right? So just as you had Putin in Russia, yes, he's in a different position, and he didn't have much to lose, you would say, but Xi Jinping has said very, very clearly that he wants to restore national greatness. He wants to make China great again, if you want to put it into Trumpian terms. And there is a centenary goal for doing this, and that is by 2049. But of course, by 2049, Xi Jinping, he may be a very great man, but he's unlikely to be around in 2049. And so, of his legacy, he would like to achieve this, if possible, on his watch, right? And so this is one of the reasons, among a couple, why you have a lot of particularly sort of people in the US military who are pushing this kind of idea of a sort of invasion timetable, if you like, because Xi Jinping has a limited window for getting this done. Now, I don't think it's going to happen unless there was some kind of domestic crisis at home that sort of made him think, the only way I can kind of get out of this is by doing something like invading Taiwan. Let's say, for example, that there was an anti-Xi Jinping faction, and he risked losing power, and he did a sort of Margaret Thatcher times 1,000. She did it with the Falkland Islands. He could do it with Taiwan, and it saved her prime ministership. Maybe he would think it could save his leadership. I don't know. But he's the big unknown. Might he be, you could say, crazy enough or bold enough to do it? And that, I think, is the big unanswered question on this.
Well, I think the takeaway, though, is it would be suicidal. And if you believe, as I do, that every day Xi Jinping wakes up and says, "I want stability," then whether it be blockade or any sort of similar actual military event around Taiwan or in the Strait would be the opposite of seeking stability. It would only create greater instability.
Yeah. I think you kind of do that mental calculus. It just in the late last year, I was able to visit Singapore, and you stare out at that Strait of Malacca, and if the U.S. parked any one of our 16 aircraft carriers, China would, it would starve from an energy perspective.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
There's nothing they could do about it. So you just think, like, you see what happened to Russia. It just doesn't make sense, and I just don't, this media frenzy, I think something that, David, you and I experienced when we visited Washington, D.C. earlier this year was this sense that the U.S. politicians are not engaging with their Chinese counterparts. There's a little bit of a group think. I think a behavioral economists would say there was a lot of this kind of just speaking one's own book, just viewing China from a defense prism and not thinking about engaging corporations and not going. It was, I think it's, it's something that really does, been one of the disappointing that the two sides are not traveling. And I know overnight, the U.S. ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China didn't meet, as part of all the ambassadors meeting with President Xi. So, maybe that can help start, it's some small little victory from that perspective.
No, I think that's right. Look, Brendan, you and I were in Washington. I think it was either the same week or only a few days after the so-called balloon, the balloon gate. And, that had kind of captured everyone's attention and everyone's imagination, I suppose. I don't read that much about the balloon anymore, which is interesting. I think, it's certainly not relevant to the discussion around the Taiwan Strait. Washington gets whipped up. But I always remind myself that, Hollywood very much wants to do business with China. Wall Street, we understand the relationships and capital flows associated with U.S.-China relations. Main Street businesses, just look at sort of the Fortune 50. And it becomes very clear. You mentioned Apple, but we can go down the list.
Oh yeah.
That the second largest economy in the world, 1.3 billion people, increased consumerism, actually a government policy to promote consumerism represents opportunity. I would suggest to you that Washington, but more specifically, the U.S. House of Representatives is a little bit out of step with others in the U.S., which is why, I come back to what I think is the very significant comments made by the British Foreign Secretary today, which represents a more measured and most importantly, pragmatic approach to UK-China relations, and one that I think is privately becoming the policy in Washington in the administration, if not in the U.S. Congress.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, I thought one of the great things about the great research piece that you wrote was that you visited this Kinmen Island, which I think most of us, when we think about Taiwan, you read it's 100 miles, 90 miles where Taipei, the city of Taipei is, but you actually visited this island, these two islands. One is a little bit more of an old fortress. The other one, but it's actually a lot of people live on it, and this is literally 3 miles from China, from a major Chinese city.
I think the easiest way of showing it is I had a couple of screenshots of the map, which you can bring up. I think you've still got the presentation in front of you. If we can do that. No, the other way.
Yeah. I mean, I think
here we are. Right. So so this island, it's called in English Kinmen, or it's pronounced Jinmen in Chinese. It means Golden Gate. So if you look at the left-hand side there, you'll see that was where I was. So it looks as though I'm in mainland China, and I got a mainland signal on my phone. It's a 1-hour flight west from mainland Taiwan. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see just how close it is, especially little Jinmen, which is the smaller island there. And it's literally 6 kilometers from the city of Xiamen, which is the biggest city in Fujian province. It's so close that actually that some of you, I'm sure, will have heard of Justin Lin, who was the World Bank's chief economist. In 1979, he was a Taiwanese army captain based on Jinmen. And he decided he wanted to defect to the PRC, and he literally swam across the strait there. So that gives you an idea of just how close it is. But it also gives you a close of how vulnerable Taiwan is too. I mean, it's so close. I mean, you can look over and see the city of Xiamen, and actually. Jinmen was the site of the last the only kind of hot war, if you want to call it that, between the two sides. So in 1958, the PLL Navy attacked the island, and the attack went on for a month. And they dropped 80,000 shells. And while I was staying there, I chatted with an old man in his mid-70s, a Mr. Wu, who had been shelled in his village as a young man. There he is, yes, as a young boy. So he was evacuated out to Taiwan Island, never been there before. But he's now back. He runs a guest house, and the island, despite being right next to China, is now really a tourist island. And so when I was there was a marathon going on, and thousands of people had flown in from the main island. So it now feels more like a sort of military museum than anything else. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that, you can see these kind of iron spikes stuck on the beach there. So all the beaches are covered in iron spikes to try to prevent an invasion. But I think, the feeling there now is that the island was once heavily militarized with 100,000 troops. They've now all gone because they realize that China can take it so easily if it wants to. There's no point defending it. And the locals seem to think that actually this is almost the safest place to be now. But it's also the case, though, that if China did decide to invade, they could potentially use Jinmen as a sort of test case, right? So they could take it very, very easily indeed, and then they could see how the US reacted. Would there be a massive military buildup? Would there immediately be sanctions? And then they could decide from there sort of what to do next. Because I think one thing we haven't spoken about, we've been saying how we don't think there's going to be an invasion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and how some people are playing this up. But I think, it is worth noting that, China is spending a lot of money on its military. It is doing all of these exercises. The threat level is there. And it is a fact that, Xi Jinping, who is head of the military, has instructed the military to be sort of modernized by, according to CIA intelligence reports, 2027. And I think this is one of the major reasons for this sort of invasion timetable that people have in their heads. And I would say that people are making a simple mistake here. And that is that 2027 is not a timetable for invasion. It is a sort of deadline for modernizing the military. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
And so what China is trying to do is to ensure that it has the capability to take Taiwan if it needs to, if it wants to. But that's not the same thing as having the intent of doing it. Right? We don't know that for sure, but for the reasons that David said, it doesn't actually make sense because it's so risky. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't work, at least if we think about it rationally. And again, I will point out again, we might have said the same thing actually for Russia and Ukraine. And Putin didn't do what you might argue was the rational thing, but it's a different circumstances. And you've already made that point.
It's a good point, Tom. And when you're a U.S. diplomat in Singapore, or really anywhere in the region, it becomes very clear in sort of your first hour at post that the United States Navy has naval superiority in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the entire Western Pacific. And not surprisingly, that bothers Beijing. Beijing that is still striving to have a blue water navy, something they've never had, at least not in modern history. We can sort of, make technical arguments, but that bothers China. We are, very much in a bipolar world, and China wants to have the type of navy required to protect China. And, I keep going back, and this will be the third time I mention it, but the British Foreign Secretary's comments earlier today speak to that. The UK wants to talk to China about their increasingly capable military and sort of understand the rationale behind the development of the PLA Navy and other aspects of China's military buildup, and that's fair.
Can I just say, as a Brit, though, I wouldn't put too much store in what he says. And Britain's China policy has been all over the place. It has no proper strategy at all. So possibly we now have a government which is a little more rational, so things might begin to change. But I would just be careful there.
Well, that's fair. That's fair. But we're doing this webinar today, and I couldn't notice a speech made only a few hours ago. Yeah. And to me, it reflects a pragmatic policy, and it's one that I think increasingly will be attractive to decisions.
It is, but at the same time, you also have the UK as being a part of AUKUS, and part of this military pushback along with the US and Australia, which the Chinese hate. So there is the other side. Too.
Look, I mean, AUKUS I think it's good that we touch on AUKUS because it's relevant. I think that it's more evidence of, again, I'm speaking from the U.S., from the U.S. perspective of the importance of firming up alliances. And, it started with providing access to nuclear propulsion technology to Australia, and it's now grown into something more, as has the Quad. So what we're seeing is the U.S. And the West increasingly strengthening its alliances in the Pacific, whether that be with Japan, Australia, the UK, while technically not an ally, bringing India into the Quad are very relevant. And that is something I think Beijing is watching very closely. Beijing recognizes, especially in the context of what happened in Europe, that any type of aggressiveness that is misunderstood would only drive other countries in the region more firmly into the arms, if you will, of the United States or the Europeans. And that goes into, I think, the cost part of the cost-benefit analysis that any decision maker in Beijing would have to utilize.
And one of the questions from Adrian is, and again, if the questions, you can email us at info@KraneShares.com or using the Q&A button if you're joining us on Zoom. But one of the questions is just that because of this economic intertwinedness, that I think something that David, that you experienced in the meetings, your great conversations with Lee Kuan Yew, the famous founder of modern Singapore, was that China would play the long game and want Taiwan to be so interdependent upon China. And it's kind of interesting, the latest export-import data out of China actually showed that, ASEAN in general is a growing share of China's trade balance. And just, is that kind of, you think the end game? And Tom, just kind of curious, if you have any thoughts on Adrian's question.
Go ahead, Tom.
I can go ahead if you want. I was going to sort of talk a little bit about sort of economic independence, interdependence between Taiwan and China, and how that sort of plays into domestic politics, because we haven't spoken about that yet. So I thought that might be a kind of nice segue in. Please. So traditionally, what PRC has tried to do is to try to knit Taiwan more closely to it, so that it becomes economically independent, with the eventual sort of end game sort of unification. So economics first, and then politics. And the way that domestic politics in Taiwan works is that you have these two major parties, the DPP, who are sort of independence leaning, and then you have the nationalists, who are much more willing to work with China, and the pendulum sort of swings between the two, if you like. At the moment, we have a DPP government, and there's relations with Beijing are totally frozen. Commercial ties, there's still trade, but a lot of commercial ties have also been frozen. And the hope in Beijing at the moment, I think, is that with the election in January of next year, that the nationalists get back into power. Because if that happened, I think you'd see a rapid political a rapprochement, and then you'd see much better economic ties again. And this could work in a similar way to what we saw back in 2008, the last time we saw a swing from the DPP to the KMT under the government of Ma Ying-jeou. And so there you saw an immediate sort of heating up of economic ties. You saw the signing of a landmark trade agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now,
and even a summit in Singapore, where President Ma, I suppose in his last year, met with China, met with the PRC in Singapore.
Well, yeah, I mean, the KMT are always, they believe in, so KMT are the nationalists, they believe in dialogue, and you saw the vice president of the KMT, actually, he spent 10 days in China a couple of months ago. And so that's a big difference. So I think at the moment, actually, sort of Beijing is playing it reasonably cool, because it doesn't want to alienate voters in Taiwan, which is what happened in 2020. So they just had the crackdown in Hong Kong, and that scared off any voters voting for the nationalists, because they would like to cooperate more closely with Beijing. They don't, they still want to remain independent, but they believe in doing things in a more cooperative manner. And I think the way I would sort of liken this is a bit of a crude analogy, if you like. But if you're backed into a corner as Taiwan is, and you have a kind of snarling animal coming at you, let's call it a dog. I'm not likening the Chinese to a dog, but just say that. But if you have a big scary animal coming at you, what's the best way of protecting yourself? Is it to kind of wield a big stick, if you like, or is it to throw the dog a bone? And the way it works is that the DPP believe in greater armament, of working more closely with the US and their allies, and economic diversification. That's the stick, and just having a strong deterrent. Whereas the KMT, the nationalists, believe that the better way is to throw them a bone and to cool tensions through dialogue and keep some distance with the US. And these are two fundamentally kind of different ways of going about things. Basically, it's the military approach versus the more diplomatic approach. And what I would say is, I'm not a politician, but I think from Taiwan's perspective, probably doing a little bit of both is what makes sense. You want to be militarily strong, you want to have good relations with the US and your other allies, but also it makes sense, frankly, to be talking to China. It makes sense to keep that dialogue open, and it makes sense to have good economic relations with them.
Yeah, I think even the U.S. push to have sensitive semiconductors actually built in America. There was some pushback in Taiwan that why are we building a factory in America? It should be here in Taiwan, employing Taiwanese. Why are we?
Yeah, they don't see that as being very serious, right? So I mean, that factory, TSMC makes all of their good stuff in Taiwan, and the US isn't actually capable of making the good stuff, and so that was seen very, very much as a political sop to the Americans.
Yeah, and even some of the chairman's comments, were pretty negative toward the U.S. employees and U.S. politics there. One question from one of our friends in Milan, Italy, is around what's the China's population side? What's China's view to Taiwan? And I think what's interesting, I think, in the West and the US in particular, something we experienced, David, the century of humiliation, the opium wars, that history, I don't think is very well understood here in the US. But one of the interesting things that I saw recently about Taiwan was, someone saying that, those are our aunts and uncles, those are our cousins, or, we have family there. Why why would we, do a military situation when, we might have those family ties there? But just kind of curious, from your perspective, maybe Tom and David, if you have.
Right. So I think there are a few things to say here. So on the Taiwanese side, there's a lot of affection for the mainland, and that's not just people who come from families who are from the mainland. It's just simply because people have done a lot of business there, and a lot of people have spent time and lived in places like Shanghai, right? I was speaking to one person in Taipei who works at AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce, and she was telling me that she had friends who are factory bosses in Taiwan who said if there ever was a war, the first thing they would do would be to hop on a plane and get to China, where it would be safer, and they've got loads of friends and they've got family, right? So there are some people who think in those terms. And I've never met anyone in China who disliked Taiwan, who has bad things to say about the Taiwanese people, right? There's a lot of affection there. At the same time, though, politically, I personally have a lot of friends who are sort of artists, and let's put it this way, a little more alternative in their views. And they couldn't care less about Taiwan. I would happily say, you know what, if they want to be independent, let them do it. But that's very, very unusual, right? 99.9% of people on mainland China believe that Taiwan is Chinese and should come back to the motherland. And that is what they've been taught from day one. And I can tell you, I once taught in a primary school in Beijing, and I remember coming in and had this bunch of 9 and 10-year-olds who were looking really angry, and sort of they came in with kind of white-knuckled fists. And I said, what the hell is wrong with you? And they said, oh, well, we've just been learning about what those Japanese did, and then about Taiwan. And Taiwan is Chinese. And this is what they're told from day one, right? So most people do believe that, and they think it's perfectly reasonable for Taiwan to come back, and it should eventually come back to the motherland. But there's certainly no kind of ill feeling towards Taiwan. I'd say quite the opposite.
Yeah, look, I think, it's very hard to know. You get this question, what do the Chinese people think? Well, there's a lot of them. And I'm not sure anyone can really answer the question about any subject. What do the Chinese people think? But I think we also need to take a very sober consideration of the, events. This is an unresolved civil war from the perspective of the Chinese people. And nationalism, no country has a proprietorship on nationalism. The U.S. and the U.K. certainly have, their own version of nationalism, and the mainland Chinese, the PRC, they have their version of nationalism. And it's not surprising that people will characterize Taiwan as sort of separatist and part of this unresolved civil war. And that's why I think we'll see from Beijing a pragmatic, practical approach towards an integration of Taiwan into mainland China. To me, that doesn't argue for any type of move, whether it be military or otherwise, that might provoke the world to Taiwan's side. It actually argues for the opposite. It argues for a slow policy to convert the status quo into a ultimately in the long-term reunification of Taiwan and China. And it's very hard for any of us to project out many years to see what that might ultimately look like. But I can say that if we see the trajectory of China, forget about 1949, let's just go to 1979. The development of China has been, in my humble opinion, closer to what we have experienced as citizens and our lives in the West. And I think that's the trajectory that China is on, and ultimately where Taiwan comes out as China moves in that direction will be, very interesting, and one of the great stories. But the greatest story, I think, will be the trajectory of China, and Taiwan is just a small part of that.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately, the U.S., a lot of the sacrifice was made by, the U.S. in World War II. And so the U.S. has a vested interest in Asia. And then at the same time, China as, the growing regional power and, doesn't want to be dependent upon the U.S. Navy for safe oil passage or commodities. And so, I think, one of the things that's, you see that flights between Taiwan and the mainland are back up and running. That actually one of the few ways you can actually get to China is going to Taiwan on EVA Airlines, Evergreen Airways, and flying. And, I think hopefully something that we as business people that, you did, Tom, that, we've been doing is getting on airplanes and meeting with people and having coffee and meals. And it's certainly hope that the two sides, diplomats from the two sides can see how vested the interests are.
Yeah, I mean, we can, but my wife, who is Chinese, can't, right? And she could 10 years ago. It was independent travel for Chinese when there were better relations between the mainland and Taiwan, allow that to happen. But I mean, it's impossible for her to go to Taiwan at the moment, and that might change if the nationalists win the election at the
it's interesting, Brendan. You sort of remind us of the important shipping lanes and the dependence China has on the free flow of goods across the Pacific. It wasn't that long ago when I was, serving in Singapore that the United States was leading this multi-country, this multilateral effort, an anti-piracy effort in the Gulf of Aden, and China, while technically not a party to the exercise, had ships in the region and was communicating with the multi-party exercise and patrol. So officially not a part of the exercise, but it was understood by the U.S. Navy as well as other navies participating that China is a part of that story to protect the transport of goods and protect against piracy at the time, which was a big problem off the coast of Africa.
Okay, well, I know we're just past the top of the hour, and one question we got from R.H. Davis that I just wanted to, it's a little bit separate. Tom, I don't know if Gavekal is the position, but one thing that I mentioned was that this geopolitical has kind of weighed on the China securities, but you don't see that with Taiwanese stocks. You don't see it with Japanese stocks, which, if you believe the worst case scenario, this is gonna, it'd be a terrible regional event, for Australia and, a whole host of others. But even U.S. multinationals, if it's Tesla or ExxonMobil or Apple, these great, U.S. and global multinationals really don't have a beta that are geopolitical. And I think one thing that we would point out is, while the political narrative gets a lot of media attention, the U.S. dollar has been very strong since the end of January. And, some of the rally that we saw in K-Web after the party Congress was actually accompanied by a weak dollar. And, once global investors really started taking the Fed seriously, you've seen the dollar get quite strong, and it's really affected a lot of risk assets globally, including Chinese equities. So I think the geopolitical gets a lot of attention, but definitely take a look at the dollar strength. And even today, the offshore renminbi, CNH, the Asia dollar index are off pretty handedly. But just wanted to address that question a little bit, the sidebar. But Tom, we're so appreciative. You just, we're great. We love great research here at KraneShares, and you wrote a really good piece. Certainly Gavekal.com and certainly the Gavekal Dragonomics team in specific, we're consumers of your research, and just really thankful for your participation today and with David, and keep up the great work. And, I think you're already getting some nice comments on just some folks, saying that, they really did enjoy today. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and really looking forward to, hopefully we can collaborate in the future. And again, just want to thank you for writing a good piece, and for you and your colleagues for, joining us today. We're very much appreciative.
Sure, pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, with that, thank you again. If you wake up tomorrow and want to ask a question, just email us anytime at info@KraneShares.com. Certainly, to learn more about Tom, Gavekal Dragonomics, please visit Gavekal.com. Certainly, if you want as an institutional investor, if you want a proper introduction, we're happy to make it. Please email us, and we're happy. We want to reward good work when we see it, and certainly Tom and the team did a great job. But thank you again for joining us today.